The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon for those of you in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Welcome to the second session of this webinar, so SharePoint for Pharma, validating SharePoint for regulated life sciences applications. My name is Paul Fenton. I head up the Montrium group here in Montreal. And today we're going to be focusing on how we can adapt a strategy for validating SharePoint within the life sciences. We are actually organizing a whole series of different talks this year, and we'll be talking about the other subjects at the end of this webinar. The goal behind this webinar series is really to provide an informative series of discussions which will allow us to showcase different applications within SharePoint 2010 specifically for the life sciences. The idea is that we're aiming to provide a very good grounding for attendees on how they can use SharePoint for regulated activities. At the end of the webinar, we'll be sending out an email message giving you information on how you can actually request copies of these slides. They'll also be posted onto our website. During the webinar, you should feel free to ask questions. There are some of my colleagues who are also online who are able to answer questions as we go through the slides. You can also send questions, of course, via email at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. Today, we'll start off by looking at what are the objectives of validation. We'll then discuss some of the regulatory requirements, both in North America and in Europe. We'll then talk about the notion of electronic records and how to identify them, because that's very key when defining what needs to be validated. We'll then talk about SharePoint itself and how we can use it and how we can use the different components of it within GXP environments. At that point, we'll then start focusing more on documentation, and we'll talk about a documentation model that we've developed here at Montrium to be able to qualify not only SharePoint but also various different applications that we can deploy within a qualified SharePoint environment. We'll also talk about a validation pack that we have available. We'll then touch on implementing configuration and change control procedures for SharePoint and what some of the challenges are. We'll talk about maximizing quality and return on investment when deploying SharePoint. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some lessons learned and best practices. So let's get started. So what is computer systems validation? Computer systems validation is primarily a process which ensures that systems consistently operate as they were intended or to their intended use. It also is a mechanism for us to ensure that user, business, and regulatory system requirements have been met. And it's important for us to be able to show this for the regulatory agencies. It's a mechanism for us to ensure that all of our information and data is secure and is being properly managed by the system. And it also ensures that the proper procedures. So obviously computer systems allow us to implement technical controls, but we also need to have procedures and processes which can be manual in place for the use and management of the system. So in terms of the regulations, the primary regulation when it comes to computer systems within the life sciences, and you know, it's obviously the regulation that's been put in place by the American government, but is considered pretty much a gold standard across the world, is 21 CFR Part 11. And there are various different parts of 21 CFR Part 11, but the primary part that requires us to validate systems is 1110A, which says that there should be validation of systems to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. Another piece of regulation which describes validation is ICH E6, or Good Clinical Practice, Section 553A, which requires that we ensure and document that the electronic data processing systems conforms to the sponsor's established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and consistent intended performance. So we're always seeing the same kinds of requirements from these different regulations. Another regulation, of course, which is very important is Annex 11 in Europe, which is really considered an equivalent regulation to 21 CFR Part 11. And there was actually a recent update to that regulation, which it makes it actually much more specific. And there's Section 4 of Annex 11, which really deals with validation, and more importantly, requires that we use a risk-based approach now. Another document which is very important is the PICS guidance for inspectors. So PICS, Annex 11, PI 0113, Good Practices for Computerized Systems in Regulated GXP Environments. This is a very important document because it really spells out exactly what the inspectorate is looking for. And it's a document that's used by the inspectorate in Europe, but also in Canada and now in the US. The last piece of guidance which is important is more on the GMP side, US FDA General Principles of Software Validation, Final Guidance for Industry and FDA Staff 2002. So all of these regulatory documents give us, in some form or another, guidance as to what the expectation is. And so what is that expectation? The first expectation is that procedures should be in place to ensure that the systems used in regulated activities are adequately validated. So we have to have SOPs around validation. There's also an expectation that systems be maintained in a validated state through effective change control mechanisms. So you have to have, a change control process to be able to maintain the validated state. And any changes have to go through change control. There's also an expectation that sponsors take a risk-based approach to computer systems validation so that they can really focus on what's very important, which is primarily patient safety, data integrity, and product quality. And then finally, there's an expectation that individuals involved in CSV activities and the maintenance of these validated systems have adequate experience and training. So now we sort of understand what the expectations from a regulatory standpoint is. Let's now talk about electronic records, because all of these systems are managing electronic records, and that's why we have to validate them. And to be able to do that, we need to really understand what is an electronic record. And in 21 CFR Part 11, Scope and Application 2003, there are 4 clear definitions of what FDA considers to be an electronic record, and this quite often can be the basis of our validation scope or strategy. So the 4 different types of electronic record, the first is records that are required to be maintained under a predicate rule and that are maintained in electronic format in place of paper format. So these are true electronic records, electronic source records rather. There is no paper at all here. The second are records that are required to be maintained under predicate rules and that are maintained in electronic format in addition to paper format. So we're really talking about electronic copies of paper source documents and that are relied upon to perform regulated activities. The third type are any records that are submitted to FDA under predicate rules, even if such records are not specifically identified in agency regulations, and if these records are submitted in electronic format. So pretty much anything you're submitting through the eCTD mechanism. And then finally, electronic signatures that are intended to be the equivalent of handwritten signatures, initials or other general signings required by predicate rules. So any electronic signatures we're doing that are required by predicate rules would be considered Part 11 electronic records. So now let's think about electronic records within the context of SharePoint. So there are 5 different types of records that we could imagine creating or maintaining within SharePoint. The first and most obvious one, of course, is documents, and then in fact any documents that are required to be maintained by predicate rule. And here we need to make a distinction when it comes to metadata. because we can have metadata which is descriptive, but we're not using to make decisions, regulated decisions, and there could be other metadata that we're actually collecting which we are using to make regulated decisions. And in those cases, the metadata columns could also be considered electronic records. The third type of item within SharePoint could, of course, be InfoPath forms, which we're using to document regulated activities or to generate evidence of quality. And these forms, of course, also need to be considered electronic records and maintained, validated and maintained as such. The fourth type of record could be any electronic or digital signatures which are used to sign records required by predicate rules. And these signatures could be either third-party signature solutions, such as CoSign, for example, or it could also potentially be the native Microsoft electronic signature functionality. But any electronic signature or digital signature would, though, be considered a record. And then finally, the audit trail. So SharePoint does have audit trail capabilities, and it's greatly improved in SharePoint 2010. And so anything that we're generating an audit trail on, so any electronic record, in fact, that has an audit trail, that would also be considered a record in SharePoint. So when we're trying to work out, okay, so is this an electronic record or not, either in or outside of SharePoint, there are a certain number of questions that we can ask ourselves. So if I've actually identified 4 different questions, and if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then basically 21 CFR Part 11 applies, and the system would need to be validated. So the questions are: does the record exist in electronic format with no paper source? So here we're talking about electronic source documents. Is an electronic copy of a paper record being used to drive a regulated process within the system? Is the record required by predicate rule? So, we may have an electronic document or record, but it may not be required by predicate rule, and therefore we wouldn't necessarily have to validate the system. And then finally, does the record drive a regulated process or decision? So these are the kinds of questions you need to ask to be able to work out exactly whether, first of all, you need to validate the system, and if so, what's the scope? So you typically would validate this in your validation assessment document if you're producing one, or otherwise in your validation plan. You should also clearly identify the scope of validation within that document based on the actual processes or records that you're managing. So let's now talk about how we could potentially use SharePoint within a GXP context. So for those of you who don't know SharePoint at this point, SharePoint is a web portal technology that's highly customizable. So it's really a framework that Microsoft has provided us with, where we're able to build out collaborative environments to manage a whole series of different things. One thing that's also very prominent is it's a very simple and user-friendly environment that people can quickly adapt to. And so we're seeing that there's a lot of success now within all different industries, including our industry, the life sciences, with this platform. Now, within a GXP context, SharePoint can be used to, of course, manage documents and even GXP records through the Record Center functionality. We can design electronic forms using InfoPath for the collection of data for everyday operational GXP activities. Typically, we're an industry that uses a lot of different forms, and so it's very easy to migrate those forms over to this particular format, so InfoPath format, and distribute them within the SharePoint environment. We can manage lists and trackers of information centrally. Typically, we've used a lot of Excel tracking sheets and even ad hoc access database to be able to track information, which has a lot of problems associated with it with regard to versioning and just understanding, okay, so what's the latest version of our Excel tracker and who's got it, sort of thing. Whereas with SharePoint, we're able to centralize these things very easily, and we also, of course, have full audit trail on them as well. We're able to manage the distribution of information and collaboration between geographically dispersed teams. Of course, within the life sciences, typically we work with organizations and people pretty much across the globe, of course depending on the size of the company. And so it's very important to be able to centralize our collaborative environment, and SharePoint really allows us to do that because it is obviously a web-based technology. We're also able to implement interactive workflows in line with our SOPs to better manage processes, and this is an extremely important part of the platform, being able to predefine exactly the route that a process should follow and providing people with various different tasks to be able to actually execute on that process is very important. Also, we have evidence of that process being followed, of course, with our audit trail within the system. And so that's a very, very powerful part of SharePoint and is being used more and more within the industry. And then finally, we can also generate real-time metrics and KPIs through the use of dashboards, which of course gives us a much better understanding of what's going on within our processes and also facilitates decision making. Now, all of that sounds very good, and I'm sure that a few of you have probably got some ideas now that we've discussed those things, but there are also a lot of challenges as well using SharePoint within a GXP context. I think first of all, SharePoint can be used in so many different areas, not just in our industry, but in all industries. It can actually get very quickly out of hand. So it's very important to have a very good governance surrounding the use of SharePoint, and also making sure that you have a proper architecture which will allow you to have both regulated and non-regulated content. It's also extremely important to have proper configuration control mechanisms in place within your validated SharePoint environment. You've gone to a lot of trouble to actually validate that environment, and so it's important that you don't invalidate it through not having proper control over the configuration. Another challenge is really just the granularity, because we're managing a lot of different activities and records and processes within the SharePoint environment, because we have a lot of records within clinical R&D or in manufacturing or device development. It's very, very difficult to be able to manage all of that, and so it's very important to have a proper process in place to allow you to actually document how the system has been configured. Now, here at Montrium, we've gone through quite a few different SharePoint implementations within the life sciences, and we also have, of course, developed a series of different workspaces that we use for managing various different activities within the regulated space. And so we've developed an approach which we feel is a very effective approach for qualifying and validating SharePoint. We have three primary stages, and at the bottom of the screen is really the foundation, which is the hardware and the prerequisite software. So we obviously need servers, we need to have Microsoft Windows, we need to have our database server. All of this needs to be in place, and it all needs to be qualified. And so we have what we call our hardware verification and installation verification for all of these prerequisite pieces before we even start installing SharePoint. And so it's very important to get that in place first. After that, we have the second level, which is really the baseline SharePoint validation. And here at Montrium, we've developed a strategy, a validation strategy for SharePoint within the context of 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. SharePoint is an off-the-shelf software, and so it's already undergone significant validation by Microsoft, who actually produce the software. And so really what we're doing is we're really just concentrating on the different parts of SharePoint which could be considered under 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. And we have all of our validation documents which allow us to validate against that. Once we've got that baseline SharePoint installed and validated against Part 11 electronic records, we're then able to deploy other pieces which will allow us to actually use the platform for regulated activities. The first piece is really third-party applications, which typically we use to enhance the SharePoint environment. So things like Cosign for digital signatures, Nintex for automated workflows and business process management, and then AdLib for things like PDF rendering and publishing. And so typically we need to qualify these pieces. Sometimes we'll just do an installation qualification. Other times we'll actually do a full set of validation documents, really depending on whether this is a pure off-the-shelf piece of software or whether there's a certain amount of configuration that needs to happen, or even if it's a custom software which is coming from a third party. We then have custom SharePoint applications and solutions, and so these are typically solutions that are being built by either yourselves internally or by third parties, but they're fully customized to your particular organization. And there we need to have a whole series of other documents, so specifications, design documents, and then validation documents and SOPs to manage the applications. And all of these typically will also cross-reference your baseline SharePoint 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records documentation. Finally, we have SharePoint configuration. So this is really taking the existing functionality within the SharePoint environment and configuring it. And here we have 4 different levels of configuration. We have configuration at the system level, at the central admin level, at the user level, and at the application level. And here, in terms of documentation, we need configuration specifications to clearly document exactly what was configured in case we lose the system, or if we need to go back and understand what the configuration was at a particular point in time. And again, we also need to have SOPs which help us actually manage the configuration process for SharePoint. Before we actually get into the details now of documentation, let's just talk briefly about risk evaluation and scoping the validation strategy. With Annex 11 and even with the CGMPs, over the last few years, the agencies have really been encouraging us to use a risk-based approach for the validation of computerized systems. The reason why they've done this is because people were going really overboard with the amount of validation they were doing. They were validating everything. And typically, that was creating a lot of overhead, and it was also potentially reducing quality because the likelihood of human error was actually much greater. And so since around sort of 2006, 2007, we've been using this risk-based approach, and there are various different methods that you can use to actually perform a risk assessment. The idea is that we want to reduce the validation effort and we want to improve quality. So when we start thinking about risk evaluation or risk assessment within the context of SharePoint in regulated environments, we need to think about the type of system we're dealing with. And really here we're dealing with an off-the-shelf system. And so the amount of risk that system poses is probably less because it's already undergone significant testing and validation by Microsoft. And if we're really just using existing components of that system without necessarily doing any coding or anything like that, then we really can probably just focus our validation efforts on high-risk areas. And high-risk areas would probably be related to the management of data or electronic records. It would be anything that could have an impact on patient safety and anything that could have an impact on product quality. So really anything that's governed by predicate rule. When we do a risk assessment, we typically measure risks at 2 different levels. We first of all measure risk at a high level, which is really procedural. So we're thinking about the procedures that this particular system is going to be managing and what's the level of risk of those procedures. Once we've done that, once we've thought about the procedural risk, we can then get into more detail. So functional risk assessment really based on the parts of the system that we feel pose a high procedural risk. So we're doing it in 2 different steps. And the focus of this talk today is not really to get into a lot of detail on risk assessment, but it is important to know that this is the approach that you should be taking. And so you should be evaluating your system for which procedures it's managing, and then which functions are being used to be able to perform those procedures. Typically, when we do a risk assessment, we can also categorize risks into regulatory risk or business risk. And you may decide that you're only actually going to be focusing on regulatory risk. You may not care about the business risk, depending on the type of process or application that you're using SharePoint for. If you do use a risk approach, and that's really the expectation, it's extremely important to indicate that within your validation plan, and also provide the rationale as to why you're using a risk-based approach, and why you feel that the level of risk that you want to test for is acceptable. When you're doing your risk assessment, it's very important to make sure that the risk assessment is carried out by a knowledgeable team. So you're not just doing it with one or 2 people from IT. It's really a team that represents all of the different stakeholders in the system. So we're talking about people from QA, from regulatory affairs potentially, representatives from the end user groups or the process owner groups, and then of course IT does play a role as well, and they should also be present. But it's very important to have that knowledgeable team. You should also be very strict, because with enough debate, everything really can become high risk, and so it's very important to have a moderator to keep things moving along and really be focused. So let's now sort of talk in detail about computer systems validation and the model that we can adopt to really help us move along. The model that we use here at Montrium, and that's used throughout the industry, in fact, in the life sciences, is GAMP5. Some people are still using GAMP4, which was the previous version. GAMP5 is a standard that was established by ISPE. It's a standard that's also quoted in the PICS guidance, so the inspectors who are looking at computerized systems within GXP environments are also looking towards GAMP as an acceptable standard for software development lifecycle and computer systems validation documentation. It's a standard that's really focused on GXP computerized systems and provides us with a framework for achieving compliance. It's something that's widely recognized in industry, and not just inspectors but auditors also use this standard a lot. It provides us with guidance for the validation of different categories of systems, and this is very, very important. A fully customized, bespoke software solution is a very different beast from something that's completely off the shelf and is just being configured. And we're able to adjust our scope of documentation and detail, in fact, based on the type of or the category of system that's being used. So that's one thing that's very valuable within the GAMP framework. If we were looking at the categories of system within that framework, and we were talking about SharePoint, then we would consider it a configured off-the-shelf system. It's expected that these systems obviously have undergone significant validation, and therefore, we can actually reduce the validation effort, as I mentioned earlier. So for those of you who don't know the GAMP framework and what we call the V model, basically on the left-hand side we have all of our specifications. So within the context of SharePoint and a configured off-the-shelf system, we basically have 3 different specifications that we would put together. A user requirement specification, and this user requirement specification really is in relation to the regulations, so 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. It could also be for a particular application that you're configuring on top of your baseline SharePoint. Your user requirement specification then feeds into functional specifications. Typically we put together functional specifications for things like workflows. or things like forms. We wouldn't necessarily put them together for existing functionality within the SharePoint environment. We then have configuration specifications. Configuration specifications really contain all of the parameters that we need to configure our SharePoint environment. Once we've done that, once we have all those specifications, we'll then configure the product. This could be done by a third party, of course, and therefore the third party's quality management system would govern that configuration. And then the configured product would then be released for configuration testing, so IQ. So this is really getting the configuration in place within the qualified environment. Once we've done that, we'll then do functional testing, OQ, where we're actually testing against the functional specification to make sure the system is functioning as it should. And then finally, we do requirements testing, which is typically done by the end users, PQ, and that will be done against the user requirement specification to make sure that we're meeting those requirements. That's really the verification phase, and once we've done that, typically the system will go into production, and at that point we fall under change control. When we do change control, we always need to do an impact assessment on the impact of the change on the existing environment, and then we get into configuration management, where we'll update configuration specifications again and then go through the same process of reconfiguring the product and then retesting the product. So this is really the framework that we're using for SharePoint. So let's now look at some of the documents and the approach that we take with these documents. As I mentioned, Montrium has a SharePoint validation pack which is developed and is already used multiple times within SharePoint deployments for the life sciences. And the first thing that we do is we actually use a validation assessment which will help us define the intended use of the system. And so this is an extract from our validation assessment document, and we can clearly see that we're really just focusing the intended use on the management of electronic records and nothing else. And we actually clearly define what we consider those records to be. So documents, data, InfoPath forms, and audit trails. We don't put electronic signatures here because electronic signatures typically would be governed by documentation for the electronic signature application that you use. So if you were using Cosign, there would be a whole series of different documents that you would produce just for that. Within the validation assessment, we also ask a whole series of questions to really establish the need to validate the system. And these are very important questions, and they can be asked, in fact, for any system within GXP environments, not just SharePoint. And basically, if the answer to any of these questions are yes, then we have to validate the system. And so within the case of SharePoint, question number 7 comes out positive. So does the system create, modify, maintain, archive, retrieve, or transmit records that must be available for inspection by a regulatory agency? And here the answer is yes, and therefore the system needs to be validated. So this is really providing the initial rationale for validating or not. Within the validation assessment, we also go through the actual regulation itself. And so we'll look at all of the different parts of 21 CFR Part 11. So in this example, we have 1110C, protection of records to enable their accurate and ready retrieval throughout the records retention period. So this is obviously directly from 21 CFR Part 11. And we basically then describe how the requirement is met. And the requirement can be met through technical as well as procedural controls. When it's a technical control, we'll describe exactly how SharePoint 2010 meets that requirement. So what are the controls that we put in place? We'll also refer to our user requirement document and the different user requirement sections that clearly describe those controls. And we'll also link us to our functional specification. And then if there are procedural controls, we'll also make a cross-reference to the SOP that actually manages that part. So here, for example, we have backup SOP. We need to have a backup SOP to ensure that we're able to retrieve records in the future. So that's an SOP that must be in place, and this is typically then filled out based on the organization that we're working with. And we do this for every single part of Part 11. So once we've done that, we've got a document which clearly states that yes, the system needs to be validated. We're only going to be validating for electronic records within the context of 21 CFR Part 11. So we've defined our scope, and then we've also described the rationale behind each of the different parts of 21 CFR Part 11 and how we feel the system or our procedures meet those requirements. We then produce the next document, which is the validation plan. The validation plan is a very important document because it really describes the procedure that we're going to be following to validate our solution. And so it really gives us a validation process. It outlines the validation scope and risk rationale. It outlines the validation approach and the prerequisite requirements. So, for example, within the context of SharePoint, a prerequisite requirement would be having SQL Server installed and qualified, having Windows 2008 installed and qualified, having qualified hardware in place, etc., etc. It could also be prerequisites in terms of training for the people that are involved in validation. The validation plan will also outline all of the documentation deliverables for the validation effort, as well as potentially prerequisite documents that need to be in place. And then finally, it'll outline all of the roles and responsibilities of everyone who's going to be involved in the validation effort. The plan should be high level and flexible, so you shouldn't be writing a very, very detailed document because, of course, you also have your CSV SOP, your Computer Systems Validation SOP, which provides all of the procedures that you follow for validation. It should, however, specify what is required to achieve compliance because you're going to measure against this when you get to the end of your effort. Have we achieved what we need to be compliant? If SharePoint is to be deployed in a controlled and non-controlled configuration where you have regulated and non-regulated spaces, then we should be clearly stating in the plan that we're only actually covering the controlled environment. We're not covering the non-controlled environment. So let's have a look at that in practice. So this is an extract from our validation plan document. So we can see in our scope that we're saying that the scope of the validation effort is restricted to the out-of-the-box SharePoint 2010 functionality, which is configured to satisfy the regulatory requirements of 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart B, electronic records. And so that's all we're doing here. Any other applications that sit on top of this that also manage regulated activities would have their own set of validation documents, as you saw earlier on in that three-step process. We're also indicating what's out of scope, so customizations that address specific business needs that are not related to 21 CFR Part 11 Subpart B electronic records. So anything that we're customizing within the system but do not that are not required for Part 11 compliance. And you can obviously add to this list as well. We then describe the validation approach. So here we have a whole series of different assumptions and also an approach that we're taking, which is used by an inspector or an auditor to really understand what you did during validation. So it's a very important part as well, which is probably one of the first things that an inspector would look at. We then have our different document deliverables. So we're describing exactly what is going to comprise the validation documentation set. And we also indicate all of the SOPs that will need to be in place, as well as any other documentation based on our validation assessment and how we're meeting 21 CFR Part 11 both technically and procedurally. Finally, we have the roles and responsibilities. So we'll have the various different roles and what their primary responsibilities are. We also clearly document in a document responsibility matrix who's actually doing what in relation to the various different document deliverables. So once we have our validation plan, we've already got our validation assessment, we've got a very clear understanding of what we're trying to validate and what's our scope and the approach that we're going to take and who's actually going to get involved. We then have our specification documents, and so the first one is the requirement specification. So typically a requirement specification documents all of our business or end user requirements, functional requirements, performance requirements, regulatory requirements, including Part 11 of course, and then system architecture and security requirements. So all of these are all contained within one specification. When we're defining user requirements, very, very important that they be precise and measurable, because of course we're testing our system against those requirements. And it's really used as the basis for developing our test scripts. In relation to the SharePoint validation pack or SharePoint validation documents, it's really limited to 21 CFR Part 11 Subpart B electronic records, and so we've only got requirements that link to those particular pieces of regulation. As I mentioned earlier, any other SharePoint applications that you decide to deploy on top of your qualified SharePoint baseline would have to have their own requirement specifications. So this is an extract of the requirement specification, and you can see on the left-hand side we have the reference to 21 CFR Part 11. So what we're seeing on screen here, for example, is the audit trail component, so 1110E, which is the audit trail requirements in Part 11, and we can see clearly what we're going to be testing against, or what the requirement is, and the fact that it's measurable. So the system must be able to capture secure audit trails on electronic records, which can be the following types of items. And so we list out what those items are in terms of electronic records. We're also indicating that we have to have a timestamp, that we have to have the identity of the user, etc., etc. So we've got a clear mapping here to Part 11 requirements versus our it's actually system requirements to be able to meet those regulatory requirements. The next document that we have is our functional configuration specification. So within the context of SharePoint, we've actually put them into the same document, and that's absolutely fine, and there's a very good reason for doing that, notably because we're actually cross-referencing configuration steps to functional requirements. So obviously when Microsoft were developing SharePoint, they already built out a very large functional requirement specification, but what we're doing here is really talking about the functionality of SharePoint to meet 21 CFR Part 11, and so how we actually meet the user requirements. The specification it also describes very, very clearly how or what steps need to be followed to be able to configure SharePoint. Off the shelf, it's not going to meet all of the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11. There are very specific things that you need to do, and this document gives us all of the information to be able to do that. If we're deploying other items or elements within the SharePoint environment, once we've actually done that baseline configuration, so things like validated info path forms, workflows, custom web parts, features or solutions, or if we're doing any integration with third-party applications, then we'll have to have additional functional specifications. So this is an example of or it's actually an extract of the functional specification and configuration specification for SharePoint. And so we can see a very clear link between our user requirements on the left and then the actual specification on how we're going to configure SharePoint to be able to meet that requirement. We also have our cross-references to our configuration steps. So here, for example, we can see CS09, which is a specific part of this document, which gives us very clear steps that we need to follow to meet the requirements. So this is an example of the configuration steps. So we can see, for example, 882, view audit log reports at the site level, gives us very clear instructions on how to actually do that. Now, once we've actually got that, the next document that we would typically produce would be detailed configuration specifications. Now, Montrium provides a series of different workspaces for records management or quality management, which really sit on top of the SharePoint baseline, so the qualified SharePoint baseline. These workspaces also have detailed configuration specifications for the structure of the SharePoint sites that we're using. And so we basically have a document which provides us with all of the site and library settings, the libraries themselves, so the description of the libraries, all of the content types that we've configured, all of the columns that we've configured, all of the security groups and user rights, and then any templates or workflows that are associated to the various different libraries or content types. And so this is a very, very important document because it really gives us all of the information that we need to then sit down and actually configure our qualified SharePoint environment. The document is versioned and is also used to document the execution and QC of that environment once it's actually been configured. Every time we want to make a change to our configuration, we should really update the configuration specification as well, and that's usually done through change control. So this is an example of that, where we have on the left-hand side, and I realize it's very, very detailed. We call it the Space Invader internally, where we see all of the various different document types that we're managing, and then all of the various different metadata values that can be associated to those content types. So that's going across the first row there. And then we indicate what is inherited, what's required, and what's optional. So this is a very important document, not only for establishing standards and taxonomy within your SharePoint environment, so that, for example, different departments who are using the same types of metadata are actually using, the same names for those metadata columns, but also it's a way for us to document exactly what's been configured. Another important document within the validation pack is obviously the traceability matrix, and it's very important to have this document for any validation effort, in fact, because it really allows us to link everything together, so all of the test scripts to the user and functional requirements. It's also a way for us to document that everything has been adequately tested. We can actually check things off using this document. And it's a document that will be used a lot during an inspection to be able to provide all the links to all of the different elements. It's also typically a living document, so as we go through a validation process and even through change control, this document tends to be updated. So it's very important to make sure there's proper version control on that. So this is an example of the trace matrix where we have our requirements, which links to specifications in the functional and configuration spec, and then afterwards the various different test scripts that we use to test that. So in this case it's OQ test scripts, so operational qualification, but it could also be installation steps. We could also meet these requirements outside of technical controls. It could be procedural controls as well. So once we've got all of our specification documents, we've got our configuration, we've built out that configuration, we actually need to install the system and do configuration testing. And so here is really the first step of testing, what we call IQ, installation qualification or configuration testing in GAMP5. And this really makes sure that all of the various different modules have been installed correctly. It also provides us with a step-by-step process for the installation and configuration of those modules. The IQ document will also clearly define what the expected results are at each control point. There are certain things that we should be seeing as we're installing the software, so dialog boxes or messages or confirmations, and we want to make sure that those control points have been properly met. It's a document that also ensures that all the documentation for the system is in place, so things like hardware qualification documents, and that the system is adequately protected through things like UPS and backup, of course. It allows us also to perform a verification of all the structural elements. So as I was saying earlier, we define everything that needs to be configured within the environment, be it content types or columns, metadata, security, all of those things in our configuration specification, and the IQ will allow us to perform the QC on that. We typically develop IQ scripts for the installation of both baseline SharePoint as well as any third-party add-ons. So this is an extract of our IQ document for SharePoint 2010, and part of it is really recording all of the different parameters for our environment. So we basically need to complete this both with the specification. Some things, they need to be completed for the particular organization, other things are there by default, and then we also put the actual result and whether it conforms or not. One of the other things that we do is really the configuration of the different elements. So here in this example, we're talking about the configuration of the record center, where we're going to store all of our final records. And here we provide very clear step-by-step instructions, as well as prerequisites, and then the parameters that need to be used during that configuration step. So that's a very important document to make sure that we actually install and configure SharePoint properly to meet the requirements. Once we've done that, we'll then perform OQ, so functional testing, to make sure that the installed environment is actually functioning correctly. And so this consists typically of end-to-end positive and negative testing to make sure that all system components are operating as intended. Within the context of SharePoint, we're really executing these tests on base functionality, and this can be done both by end users as well as, of course, the IT group. We have a test protocol which really describes exactly how everything needs to be executed, and also what the deviation management procedure is and how it should be followed to make sure that we properly manage and correct deviations. Tests are broken down into different test scripts really by functional area. And of course all of these tests have to be approved prior to execution. As we're executing those tests, we need to make sure that they're clearly documented using good documentation practices, so they're actually meeting the Alcoa requirements. And these tests really serve as a mechanism to verify that the system is operating correctly. So here we can see examples of operational qualification for SharePoint. And so we have, first of all, a whole series of different prerequisites, including prerequisite test scripts that need to be executed. Test scripts usually follow a very specific sequence. We'll also record the parameters that we're using for testing. Afterwards, we have step-by-step instructions for the test executor for them to actually follow, as well as the expected results. And I'm sure that everybody on the call who's ever been involved in validation has already seen something very similar to this, where we actually record the actual result of the test step, whether it was a pass or fail, based on that expected result, and then who actually performed it and when. It's a very standard test script format. We can also do, following that, requirements testing, or PQ. Now, because we're really just testing the base functionality of SharePoint as an off-the-shelf system, typically we don't do PQ for baseline SharePoint, but we do PQ for any applications or third-party solutions that we're deploying on top of that. So typically, if we were deploying workflows or forms, we would actually build out PQ test scripts, which would be executed by the end user. And these test scripts really allow us to perform positive testing on the company or organization specific configuration and the user requirements that have been defined. These tests are really executed on business specific functionality and typically will follow a process. They're not really functional in nature. They also have a test protocol, and they're really broken down by business process and linked to user requirements. Again, when executing these tests, of course, we have to make sure that they're properly documented and respect Alcoa. And in general, these types of tests would be executed by the process owners or the end users, because they're really serving as a user acceptance mechanism and not really just ensuring that the system's operating properly. That's already been covered by OQ. So once we get to the end of our testing, really the last document that we produce is a final validation summary report. And this really summarizes everything with regards to the validation effort and allows us to clearly document exactly what deviations occurred and the status of those deviations. It also gives us a mechanism to be able to say, yes, this system meets its intended use as described in the validation plan or the system description. And so it's a very important document because it provides us with a very accurate overview of what actually occurred, how the system was validated, who was involved, what deviations occurred, and what's the current state of the system, and can we release it into production. In some instances, we could actually create individual summary reports, but we still need to have a report at the end of the process to say this system now meets its intended use. So let's now try and finish up. We have a few minutes left on configuration, control, and maintaining the validated state. So once you've got your SharePoint environment in place and it's all configured, it's very important that you're able to maintain the validated state. So first of all, you really need to have a procedure, an SOP, in place for managing your SharePoint environment. That SOP should govern the update and configuration, the update of the configuration specification. The configuration specification should be used really for any updates or additions to your validated SharePoint environment. We should also interact with your change control mechanisms to make sure that any updates are properly evaluated for impacts and also are properly approved. If you make significant changes or you add significant new functionality to the system, you may actually need to perform a whole new validation project. That's something that you would evaluate in change control. And then typically when you're deploying new workflows or updating workflows, forms, features or solutions, it's very, very important to perform impact assessment and that you re-execute or create new test scripts if there's any impact on your existing environment. You will of course also need to validate those items to maintain the overall validated state of the system. Maximizing quality and return on investment. This is also obviously an important one when we're trying to deploy SharePoint for the life sciences. We have to make sure that we get proper return on investment and that we can maximize quality. Validation typically is a very expensive piece of any system deployment within a regulated environment, and so it's very important to get it right first time. You really need to have a very clear strategy and you need to leverage risk assessment, because if you don't do this, your validation effort can increase significantly. You can also consider acquiring, of course, existing validation documentation, such as our validation pack, which will allow you to acquire very, very quickly the documents that you need to be able to qualify that solution, and also base yourself on the fact that those documents have already been tried and tested and therefore are likely to render less deviations. It's very important to make sure that all individuals involved are really fully trained on computer systems validation and understand why we're doing it and what the process is. It's very important to isolate your controlled environments from your non-controlled environments within SharePoint so that you can facilitate validation and configuration control. And then finally, you could also consider using virtual environments to facilitate replication between production and test. So to finish up, some lessons learned and best practices. I think the first thing that I would strongly recommend is create a big picture of your SharePoint deployment so you can really get a long-term vision of what your company wants to use SharePoint for and how you should structure it into controlled and non-controlled spaces. Use a risk-based approach, of course, but be very strict because otherwise everything becomes high risk. Remember that SharePoint is an off-the-shelf product and therefore you can limit your validation scope. Establish a validation team around SharePoint to oversee and manage the validation process, but also to manage all of the change control that you'll go through with that system over time. Make sure that you have proper SOPs and work instructions in place, which clearly define how we actually configure and administer that system, not only just in terms of configuration, but also in terms of security. And then finally, use a step-by-step deployment methodology to keep things manageable. SharePoint can be used for many, many things within the life sciences, but it's important not to take off more than you can chew. So really try and identify a very clear strategy for deployment and use that step-by-step methodology. So that really concludes the webinar for today. My final message is it's very easy to drown in detail, so try and keep it simple, especially when it comes to validation projects. The next webinar will be held on May 9th. The title of that webinar is Implementing an Integrated Approach to Quality Management Using SharePoint. So now that we understand how to qualify the baseline SharePoint environment, we're now going to start looking at various different applications that we can deploy within SharePoint. We'll be sending you out an invite, of course, to that webinar. You can also go onto our website, www.montrium.com, and onto the webinars page, and that will provide you also with links not only to the next webinar but to all of the other webinars within the series. I'm also available for questions via email, so feel free to send me an email at pfenton@montrium.com, and I'd be very happy to answer those questions. You could also call me. So thank you very much for taking the time to attend our webinar today. I hope it was very informative and gave you some ideas as to how you can use SharePoint within your organization for your regulated applications, and we very much look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.